Right, so we are recording. So here for our A Push Snow Day notes, I have the PowerPoint up on the screen here, so you should be able to follow along like normal. Obviously, if you want to have it pulled up on your own screen or whatnot at home, that's fine too. It is on the notes are on the class website where they usually are in the old notes folder. They might be a slightly outdated version. So the last time I saw you guys was a little while ago, and I think in both classes, kind of the last thing that we got to was we were talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, and we were specifically talking about kind of African Americans serving and how the Emancipation Proclamation leads to the beginning of African Americans in the U.S. military. So we should have seen like this slide that's on the screen now. Does that look like familiar to everybody? Everybody's mics off. Yes, okay, great, thanks guys. So we're kind of skimming past this, which your textbook does a fairly good job of, and we're basically picking up with the two really biggest. Seventh period has started or will start. So we're picking up with what are probably like the two biggest battles of the war, Vicksburg and Gettysburg. As with everything, we're not going to talk about the battles themselves a ton, but just more so about their significance. So the July of 1863 is a really big turning point for the war itself. Specifically right around July 4th, we have two battles that culminate, one on the western front of the war, which is the Battle of Vicksburg. This is like along the Mississippi River. And then the other one in the more sort of eastern front of the war in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So Vicksburg first, what Vicksburg is basically the thing you need to know about Vicksburg is the culmination of that second part of that Anaconda Plan that we talked about back towards the beginning of the notes. So you remember the Anaconda Plan where we want to like blockade the southern ports and then we want to take the Mississippi River and then take Richmond. This is the like take the Mississippi River part. So for the last 2 years, the western wing of the Union Army, mostly under Ulysses S. Grant, has been kind of fighting their way down the Mississippi River and also fighting their way up the Mississippi River a little bit to try to take control of this sort of major waterway. And if you look at the little map that's kind of in the upper right of the screen, you can see where Vicksburg is. It's right on the Mississippi River near New Orleans. So by May of 1863, New Orleans has already fallen. It's a major Confederate port, and the Union Army has spent about 2 years of hard fighting pushing down south, and so Vicksburg is like the last remaining Confederate port on the Mississippi. So if the Union Army can take Vicksburg, then they'll be able to send Union ships up and down the Mississippi River without any like stopping, basically. If you look at the little sort of inset map, you can see kind of where Vicksburg is. It's like on the little loop of a river. It's really well protected. It's also up on high cliffs, so it's a really like a very tough strategic point to capture. So Grant and the Union Army show up in Vicksburg around May. More bells. Show up in the Vicksburg area around May. They make two pretty determined assaults on the city of Vicksburg, which holds out. And so they wind up settling in for a siege, which is where you basically just sort of surround a city and cut it off from the outside and kind of wait for it to weaken or give up. And so from May all the way through like the second half of May, all the way through June, the city of Vicksburg is under siege. This is a big hardship for the city and for the Confederate Army. They're kind of trapped by the Union Army because remember that the whole Confederacy is already under a blockade. So you're talking about a city that was already reduced, like in terms of supplies. They're not stockpiled or anything like that. And then they're completely cut off from like the surrounding countryside, etc. So if you're looking for some of the worst like civilian suffering of the war, the siege of Vicksburg is the to me anyway, kind of the intensest example of that. The citizens retreat to caves outside the city to avoid the shelling. And I mean, there's all sorts of primary sources where they're like eating rats. And I mean, it's pretty intense, the siege of Vicksburg. So the city finally falls. Basically, there's a last, Grant and his men make a last push into the city and the Confederate defenders are worn out. And so the city itself finally like gives up on July 4th, 1863. It's a really major victory in the western sort of field. And again, on the western front, it's probably the biggest and most significant victory for the Union Army, something they've been pushing for 2 years. And at the same time, kind of coincidentally, we're going to see on the eastern front a similarly major victory happening at the Battle of Gettysburg. So Vicksburg falls on July 4th, 1863, and July 1st through 3rd is when the Battle of Gettysburg is happening. So again, they're happening kind of simultaneously, the two different wings of the army. And the Battle of Gettysburg is usually regarded as the major turning point of the Civil War. So you got a multiple choice question that was like, which of the following is a turning point in the Civil War? Gettysburg is probably going to be the correct answer. Even though you'll notice, again, we're July of 1863 here, there's still a lot of war left, right? The war won't end until April of 1865. So there's still, a little under half the war left to go. But nonetheless, this is a big turning point. It's a major Union victory, which, as we know, the Union has not had very many of up to this point. It's sometimes called, as the slide notes, the high water mark of the Confederacy. And the reason for that is it's basically the furthest north that the Confederate Army is ever really going to penetrate. There's Confederate scouts that go up further. But if you look at the map that's on the screen here, you can see here's Washington, D.C., right, the capital. Here's Chancellorsville and Fredericksville are two big deal battles down here, both Union losses. And what the Confederate Army is trying to do here is they're trying to kind of menace Washington, D.C. They're trying to get up above it, flank it, I guess you could say, and put a lot of pressure on the Union, on the United States government to surrender, basically. So the idea is if they can kind of push up into the north, if they can take some like northern countryside, if they can establish position north of Washington, D.C., then that's going to put Lincoln and kind of the Union government in a bind. Again, it's the furthest north that the bulk of the Confederate Army is going to push. And this is Robert E. Lee sort of in direct command here. The Battle of Gettysburg will last for 3 days. It's a sort of surges back and forth, day 1, day 2, day 3. The kind of battle lines go back and forth. At the center of it is a little city of Gettysburg. This would be like the size of, if you guys are familiar with like Hillsborough or Pittsburgh, sort of those cities that are kind of near to us here in Chapel Hill, just sort of like little country cities, as you can see by this, it's like at a crossroads. There's sort of rolling hills outside of town, so there's a lot of fighting in just like random farmers' cornfields. There's a fight in a peach orchard that's owned by a guy who doesn't get to grow peaches there again for a while. And then there's also like hand-to-hand fighting in the actual the streets of the little tiny town of Gettysburg itself. It's an extremely heavily studied battle. Your textbook gets into it a lot more. Again, if you're interested in the military aspects, I'm sure this is something that Mr. Malega's class spends quite a bit of time on. It's a very big deal battle. The only maybe part of the Battle of Gettysburg that might potentially come up or that would be worthwhile for you to know is the one that I have up here, this called Pickett's Charge. This is a kind of doomed charge of the Confederacy. If you can picture the Union troops entrenched on a hill called Little Round Top. They're sort of up high. They've got the high ground, and the Confederate troops from across maybe say about 3 football fields away across like a long flat field are charging across that and just getting fired down on and fired across on from Union troops. Many of them die. It's kind of a doomed charge of the Confederate troops, and it becomes a big centerpiece of we're going to talk about something called the Lost Cause, this sort of romanticizing of the Confederacy after the Civil War, of people who like to talk about the Confederate soldiers as sort of gallant men fighting for their homeland, etc. Pickett's Charge is often a big centerpiece of that. So it's good to associate that with the Battle of Gettysburg. Significantly for us, though, this is the first major loss of the Confederate Army directly under Robert E. Lee. Lee had developed by 1863 sort of like a mystique, basically. I think people said that, whispered that he couldn't lose. It was a big morale issue for the Union troops who were starting to feel like they couldn't defeat Lee. So it's a pretty big deal that he's in command when they lose here. They have a very long, they're really far extended north, right? So they have a very long retreat south. It weakens the Confederate Army significantly. They're going to have a hard time recovering from it. This is, like I said, the largest death toll of any battle in the entire war. You can see the losses down here at the bottom. It's like 50,000-60,000 almost between the two armies. It's a very, very, very large amount of people who are killed. And so as the Confederacy retreats here, like July 4th, July 5th, July 6th, what they're leaving behind is just a tremendous aftermath of numbers of corpses, of men, of horses, of, just like physical devastation. And if you can think, if any of you have ever been to Pennsylvania or any of the nearby area in like July, if you can think about what it's like, it's hot, it's humid. It actually started raining in Gettysburg on, I think it was on the 6th. It was like a day or two after the battle. And so it's just this hot, stinking, disgusting mess. And so they're just kind of frantically burying people wherever they can. They bury a bunch of bodies, and then it rains really hard and it like washes the bodies back up, as will happen sometimes when it rains. So just, it's a little tiny town that's very ill-equipped to deal with this kind of massive amount of men. Before Gettysburg, mostly they had tried to ship bodies back home. So if you were killed on the battlefield, there would be some people who were unidentified who were buried on the site, but for the most part, they would try to ship bodies back home. But that's just really not possible with the sheer number of men who are dead and the sheer sort of the necessity of moving quickly, basically because of the environmental concerns. And this is how we wind up with plans basically for there to be a national cemetery created on the battlefield of Gettysburg. So the Battle of Gettysburg is in July, early July, and it's in November that we see Lincoln travel to Gettysburg on train. He goes down for the dedication of what's going to become kind of the first of these battlefield cemeteries that we really see. The idea here is that this will be sort of nationally consecrated ground for the soldiers who are killed at Gettysburg, sort of an honorable place for them to be buried. Lincoln is invited. I think the organizers don't necessarily expect him to come, but he does decide it's important enough that he leaves Washington, D.C. and comes to the dedication ceremony himself. The guy before him, the orator before him, gives a big, long speech kind of in the style of the day. It's like 2.5 hours long. It's filled with kind of grand allusions, etc. And Lincoln gives the very, very, very famous Gettysburg Address. This is the entire Gettysburg Address that you're looking at on the screen here. So the guy before him gives like a 2.5 hour long speech. Lincoln stands up and gives this speech. If you're looking at the text, it should look very familiar to you, right? That 7 years ago has become kind of an iconic Lincoln speech. And there's a couple of things that he says in here that I think are kind of important to note. So if you were to read this, the basic gist, the argument that Lincoln is making is that he says, we, the assembled audience, we are here to dedicate this ground as hallowed, is the word that he uses, hallowed down here, consecrated, meaning holy, so that people can be buried there. That's sort of a Christian burial thing, or at least it was. And so what he says basically is that we don't really have the power to do that any more than kind of the dead have already done. So he's basically saying that the brave men who struggled here have consecrated the ground far above our poor power to add or detract. So essentially he's saying that the struggle, the fight that these men are engaging in is a holy one, that they're fighting sort of for this cause, for a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So what we see here with the Gettysburg Address is Lincoln really leaning into something that he really started with the Emancipation Proclamation, which is messaging the Civil War as a moral war, right? A war that's about a higher cause, not just preserving the Union, not just ending the South's rebellion, etc., but a war about liberty, a war about equality. The line down here at the bottom, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that shall not perish from this earth, right? That line is one that we saw way back in the Webster-Hayne debate, right? Just a kind of basic sort of fundamental ideal of American liberty that Lincoln is trying very hard to link to the struggle that the Civil War is fighting. So the year 1863, kind of between the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address, is really where we see the war very much reframed to, I think, how we understand it today, just to sort of a struggle about higher ideals, much more so than it was at the beginning of the war. So that's the Gettysburg Address, and that's sort of where that fits in. Again, remember, the Battle of Gettysburg was in July, July 1st through the 3rd. The Gettysburg Address is a few months later in November. In the meanwhile, in those months in between, there's been some other developments that we need to talk about in the Union Army. So if you remember, I mentioned that in April of 1862, the Confederacy had already started a draft, and that was a big deal because it was the first draft in American history. Well, basically, the Union Army is starting to get to the point where they're going to need to do that as well. It's becoming more and more apparent that what the Union Army really needs is like men in the fields, right? We have to replace a lot of dead killed at big engagements like Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, etc. And we need really to not just recruit people, but it's going to start to become very apparent that that a draft is going to be needed. The Union Army, I'm probably going to flip back and forth between these two, but the Union Army initiates a draft in March of 1863. So again, it's about a year after the Confederate Army's draft, which was April of 1862. Sort of a similar shape, though slightly different age range here, 20 to 45. I think the Confederacy was 18 to 35. And the way that the Union Army conducts the draft is basically by state. So the draft lottery, or the way it's set up, could look very different in like Pennsylvania or in Maine, right, etc. So it's one of those things that's left up to the states to decide how they'll draft, but they have to have a draft according to this law. A lot of the men that the draft is aimed at, and who are going to get caught up in the draft, are this sort of 25% of white men who serve who are foreign born. So remember, the Union still has pretty good amount of immigrants coming in like during the war, but also if you think about people who just sort of come in the last maybe 10 years or so before the war, that's also a very big population. And so they're trying to essentially encourage this population, Irish immigrants, German immigrants, etc., to join the war. And the draft in the Civil War is really more of a very hard encouragement to enlist voluntarily. The idea here is, I think in both sides saw it this way, that if you knew that there was a potential to be drafted, and when you get drafted, you don't get, any signing bonuses or anything like that, you don't get to choose where you go, then maybe you would be more likely to just join up, to just join up on your own. So when you see advertising for the draft, it's always like this style of thing. So it's like, avoid the draft, join on your own, you can get a signing bonus, etc. And so one of the ways that the Union pushes that is by having kind of a loophole in the draft it's usually called a commutation fee. It basically allowed any man who got drafted to hire somebody to take their place. So if you were wealthy enough to have $300, you could give the Army $300, or sometimes you could just hire someone through like a private contract. And that money would go to like a bonus basically to recruit someone in your place. So essentially the same complaint with this that people in the Confederacy had with the 20 slave law, which is that it's a way of, kind of loopholing out of the war if you are wealthy enough to do so. And so what we see as a result is the draft is like a lot of names get drawn. It's like 250,000 or so men, but of those, only about 6% of them wind up actually serving. So the draft is more of I don't even know, like encouragement's not quite the right word, but it's more of like, if you think of like a carrot and stick type scenario, it's more of the stick, right? It's trying to force people to do something that many of them maybe don't necessarily want to do or aren't super encouraged to do. And especially when it's first instituted in 1863, it's going to cause a tremendous amount of anger, to the point of causing riots, draft riots, particularly in New York. So back to Gettysburg. Gettysburg is July 1st through 3rd, and just about a week later, the city of New York is going to initiate its first what we call draft lottery. So they'll have a draft board, they set up a big wheel, it looks like a giant lottery wheel, and they draw numbers out of it to determine like who's eligible or who's going to be drafted in this sort of first round. And in New York City, there's a lot of people who are sort of working class men who are very much not in support of the idea of the draft, and also kind of not in support of the war. Very, very, very important thing to remember about New York for kind of our next few sets of notes is that New York is very heavily Democratic, like the political party Democratic. You may remember all the way back to when we were talking about Andrew Jackson and the formation of the Democratic Party, that I mentioned that the Democrats had a big immigrant population. That was one of their big constituencies, that a lot of Irish people voted Democrat, and that would continue to be a big thing. Well, that's still very much true here. New York is controlled by an organization called Tammany Hall. They're a political machine. This is something we'll talk about a lot more extensively next unit when we talk about the Gilded Age. But for now, just know that there's like the Democratic politicians essentially control New York City. They have a Democratic mayor throughout. The war has a guy named Fernando Wood. And so they're sort of out of step with the more kind of like Republican majority in a lot of the northern states and in Washington, D.C. And many people in New York, therefore, are more sympathetic with the Southern cause than in other places. That doesn't mean they're like pro-Confederate, some of them are. There's a term called Copperhead that gets used sometimes for sort of Southern sympathizers who live in the North. And they often, very often, as in New York, tend to be people who don't like the fact that the war has sort of become a war about ending slavery. It's a very racist tone to a lot of Copperheady type things. And that's basically what happens in the draft riot. So you have a lot of like Irish and German immigrants. They work on the docks, right? They're laborers, like we talked about. These are people who have come, directly from Europe. They don't really care that much about slavery. They don't really like African Americans that much. I think I mentioned when we were talking about immigration that there's a long-standing like a enmity or rivalry between the Irish immigrant community and the free Black community, and so we see that here too. So the draft riots start on July 13th with basically they're at the draft lottery, a bunch of men attack the building. You can kind of see that in the picture here. They like throw stones at the guys pulling the numbers. They set the little draft pavilion on fire, and then they sort of start to rampage and set a bunch of other buildings on fire. But by the second day or so, by like July 14th, 15th, it's sort of shifted from being a draft riot into being like a race riot. So this sort of working class, like Irish, German, New York white population are taking their anger out on the black neighborhoods in New York. So if you're angry, we don't want to go fight a war for these, insert your racial slur here, then they sort of start to surge down into the black neighborhoods in New York, and it becomes it's called a pogrom, sometimes a racial pogrom, meaning it becomes more of like a hate crime essentially than a draft riot. Question? Sure. Hmm. Well, double. Well, I'm recording it, so we'll have to put it up later because I don't want to fuss around with that right now. Thank you for checking in, though. Sorry, you guys win. There shouldn't be a 10-person limit. I'm on the school account, which should be unlimited, but just gonna let it roll. Um, so the draft riots, again, they start out as kind of an anti-war thing, and then they shift into being more like of a racial issue. I have the numbers up on the screen, but it's like 120 killed. It's pretty much the biggest race riot in American history. I think that's a fair thing to say. If you look at it that way, there's attacks on all sorts of institutions. I have the Colored Orphan Asylum is sort of the famous one that gets burned down. There's lots of lynchings. The riots are eventually put down on like the 15th and 16th. Soldiers march up. These are soldiers who just fought in Gettysburg, so they're not playing, as it were. They march up and they put the riots themselves down. The draft continues to be a thing. It continues to gain anger. Nothing quite at this level. But this is probably the New York City draft riots are probably the best example of anti-government activity in the North during the war. So if you're looking for sort of a concerted Northern like anger about the war type expression, the New York City draft riots here in 1863 is definitely the main expression of that. Yep. Questions on like the draft riots, Vicksburg, Gettysburg, anything? Anybody want to ring in before we're going to go talk about the home front a little bit here? Okay. So the home front section of the notes is one that we'll probably be splitting. I'm going to do a little bit of it today, and then probably when we get to about the election of 1864 or so, that's what we'll pick up with in class tomorrow, because that's a pretty big deal. I want to make sure that we have time to do that thoroughly. So I've already touched a bit on the home front here and there. You guys have some readings, etc. But we're going to start off by talking a bit about money, because that's one of the main issues, if not the main issue on the home front itself. So the Union and the Confederacy are both going to struggle a bit to finance the war. The Union is going to finance the war primarily through taxes. The Civil War is going to see our first income tax. In 1862, it's called the Revenue Act. The United States has never had an income tax before. We have one temporarily during the war. It's going to go away. We're not going to see a permanent income tax like we have now until basically right around World War I with the 16th Amendment. So that's the Revenue Act that you see up on the screen. So that's a big first for the Union, our first income tax. The other big first for the Union as far as money goes is the Civil War is also the first time that we're going to pass a law enabling the government to print paper money. So that Legal Tender Act that we see there in February of 1862, that's the first thing that authorizes the government to use paper money to pay government bills. So remember, that's the opposite of specie. Our distrust of paper money goes back a long way in the country. We spent a lot of time talking about this with Jackson. So this is definitely something that people kind of view with suspicion. But it does happen during the war, and the money that's printed by the government during the war, they're called greenbacks because they literally are green on the back. This is a shot of a $5 government greenback printed during the war. And the bill, if you look at it, it's sort of different than modern day money, right? If you were to pull a bill out of your wallet right now, if you looked at it, it would say basically that this money is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, right? Our money is worth money because the government says it is. This one, though, is a little bit more like an IOU. So you see up here the script, if you can see it on your screen, it says the United States promises to pay to the bearer $5, like from Washington, D.C. So this really is more along the lines of those kind of banknotes or bonds that we talked about that were coming from banks, rather than our more common, the correct term for our modern day money is fiat money, right? Money that's just based on faith in the government. The greenbacks that are printed during the Civil War are a really big deal because the government prints kind of a lot of them, and they're going to stick around. So the government will stop printing them after the Civil War, but a big part of our political debate in like the 1870s, 1880s is like, okay, what do we do with these greenbacks? Do we print more? Do we have everybody turn them in and just trade them for gold? Like, what do we do with these? So when we get to the 1870s, there's even going to be a political party called the Greenback Party. So introducing these during the Civil War will launch a whole new arena of political debate in the United States after the war. The Confederacy, meanwhile, has more money problems. This is a lot of what's on this slide is essentially what I was saying when we talked about the Confederacy way back at the beginning, which is it's very hard to fight a war as a strong federal government when you are using a lot of rhetoric about states' rights. So the Confederate Congress tries to pass an income tax. It doesn't really work. They sell a bunch of bonds, like government bonds early on in the war, but then as the Confederate cause starts to go bad, those don't go as well. So they're having a hard time getting a steady income stream. Before the blockade, they're able to make some good amount of money through cotton sales, but once the blockade closes, the Confederate government is pretty much just reduced to printing money and hoping people take it. So Confederate money looks like this. There's a bunch of different printing. Some states even take to printing their own money. And if you look at the Confederate dollar, there's a couple of interesting things on here. If you can read cursive, you'll see what's going on here. So this $20 Confederate bill from, I think this is 1861, if I'm not mistaken, down there, says 6 months after the ratification of a treaty of peace between the Confederate States, right, and the United States, the Confederate States of America will pay $20 to the bearer of this bill. So this bill is worth $20, but only after we win the war and we ratify a treaty. So that's great as long as things are going well for the Confederacy, which, remember, they are early on in the day, in the early days of the war. But once the tide starts to turn against the Confederacy, these bills become more and more worthless, right? So we're going to see a tremendous amount of inflation because people have these bills that they're relying on, and all of a sudden people don't want to accept them. So I have this bill that says it's worth $20, from the Confederate government. What food are you willing to give me in exchange? That's something that fluctuates a lot, and we're going to see a tremendous amount of inflation in the Confederacy, as we'll kind of talk about in a sec here. Civilian life during the war basically varied a ton depending on where you were. Some of you guys probably have Civil War essay topics that will touch on this. This is a big question. What was life like for civilians during the war? And that was very different if you lived in Maine, where there was never ever any fighting, or if you lived in, say Georgia, which saw intense, the Sherman's March in the last days of the war, but then didn't see fighting early on, versus if you lived in Kentucky, right, where the armies were kind of marching back and forth over it. Some commonalities that we can say, though: the closer the army is to you, the worse things were. That seems like kind of a dub, but it is definitely true. And we do see on both sides pretty considerable support for the war from most civilians, not every civilian, but most civilians. In the Confederacy, things really start to get bad about 1863 or thereabouts. The blockade is pretty much in place. The Mississippi River actions in the middle of the year, again, cut off the western part of the South from the eastern part of the South. There were really, really, really intense inflation. The Confederacy during the Civil War is a historical example of intensive inflation that gets used in econ textbooks and stuff like that all the time. So you look at the prices here, 1868, 1863, these are kind of average roughed out prices, but you can see inflation in almost everything, and then especially for things that aren't homegrown. So coffee on here. Something that's not on here, but was a huge inflation, was salt, which is bad because salt was used as a preservative for meats and things like that, not just as flavoring. So anything that couldn't be immediately made or accessed, the price just shoots up in the South, to the point where things became almost unaffordable for a lot of Southern civilians. If you're still working, wages are not coming anywhere close to keeping up with that level of inflation. Obviously, people are forced to kind of forage. We see refugees fleeing to the cities when there's battles in the countryside, and then the cities can't support them, and they have to sort of get back out into the countryside to try to, scavenge food. So lots of like movement in the South as a result of this inflation. And then most intensely, we see food riots, bread riots. I have the two biggest ones. The one in Richmond in 1863 is like the most well-known one. It's called the Richmond Bread Riot. There's a big one in Greensboro. I have Greensboro in here. I kind of want to say Greenville. Anyway, there's a big one in North Carolina as well. And a lot of these are very driven by women who are, coming to the store. They're trying to buy bread. There's bread in the store, but it's too expensive because of inflation. So if you're looking into Confederate civilian, like the impact of the war on Confederate civilians, the bread riots are an interesting place to look into, especially 1863. There's a lot of them, 1863 and 64, as the inflation really cranks up. Speaking of women, one of the main things that often gets asked is the question of how the Civil War impacts women. We certainly do see largely support for the war effort. Lots of women at home providing morale, doing fundraising. We see a lot of fundraising for the troops, especially in the Confederacy. There's a lot of things, women will get together and they'll roll bandages to send to the troops, or they will raise money to buy, boots or things like that to send to the troops. That becomes especially important as the Confederacy has a harder and harder time supplying its own men. So that type of stuff is very traditional. Same thing we saw during the American Revolution. As always, we do also see many women taking on non-traditional roles. I mentioned already that this is the first war where we really see women in a nursing role. Any time that we have men away at war, you see women taking over men's work, so working in factories in the North a little bit, farming, running businesses, etc. Always women who disguise themselves and act as spies, act as soldiers. That's something certainly that happens in the Civil War pretty extensively. And we certainly also see women working against the war cause, writing letters encouraging their husbands to come home to help with the planting, aiding prisoners and deserters. This becomes especially true as the war goes on and it gets kind of worse and worse, I guess you could say. Sorry, let me just move this out of the way. One thing that's really important, I think, though, when you're looking at the impact of the Civil War on women, is to look at whether women's status during the war changes, and that's undeniably true, especially in the sort of hardest hit parts of the South. Women have to take on a lot of sort of non-traditional roles. And then to look at the question of, do these changes last after the war? And I think that's a little less certain with the Civil War. When we look at 20th century wars like World War I and World War II, we're going to see more lasting impacts in terms of sort of like women entering the workforce that don't like get rolled back quite as much right after the war. In the Civil War, though, like you would never say don't say that the Civil War led lots of women to enter the workforce, and then now all of a sudden there's women in the workforce. That's not really a true statement necessarily. So definitely impacts during the war, impacts after the war, and the lasting level of these impacts are maybe a little bit more questionable, more individual, like person by person type basis. Okay. Okay, so last thing that I want to talk about, and something I probably will touch on at least briefly in class tomorrow as well. This is something I mentioned when we were talking about the Republican Party platform in 1860, and that is that as the Confederacy secedes, they take with them most of their politicians, not all of them, but most politicians who are in Congress, say, from southern states that secede, go with them, leave Congress as well. And so what that does is it leaves the sort of new Republican Party with a majority, a pretty like sizable majority in both houses of Congress. So you have Republicans controlling the House and the Senate. There's still Democrats there, and the Republicans have factions. There's radicals and moderates and etc. But what that means for the Republican Party is they really can get kind of a lot of almost even like non-war related stuff done. So there's a whole list of, these are all laws that are passed by the Republican Congress during the war. Of all of these, I already mentioned the Legal Tender Act, that's the money printing one, but there's like a couple that I want to draw your attention to specifically, and the really big one is the Homestead Act right up here in 1862. This is a major piece of legislation, and what it does is it gives free land, 160 acres of land for free, to anybody who will settle permanently in kind of the vast unsettled middle of the United States, so like Nebraska, right, Wyoming, etc. This is going to be a huge feature of one of our note sets right after the war when we talk about, again, why people would move to Nebraska and Wyoming. So this Homesteading Act is a major deal that I think the Republicans probably would have had a hard time passing with the Democrats in. Along the same lines down here, this 1863 Pacific Railway Act, this is going to provide federal funding to do something that we've been talking about for a long time, and that's build a transcontinental railroad. So the money to build a transcontinental railroad, which will be completed in 1869, I'm going to say, I think is when that's complete. That is provided by, again, this Republican pushed through Pacific Railway Act in 1863. Other things that you'll see on here, so tariffs, which obviously most Democrats were kind of against, land grants, etc., the Emancipation Proclamation, obviously. So this is a good examples of like things that passed through Congress that might not have passed in a situation where you have a more balanced like Republican and Democrat setup. And continuing with politics in the home front, the next thing that's going to come up is the 1864 election. I think this is where we're going to pick up in class tomorrow. So the 1864 election's got kind of a lot going on that's worth talking about and worthy of talking about itself. So we'll pause right there. That's about right in terms of a normal amount of notes for a day. Questions on anything that we talked about from like Gettysburg and Vicksburg through some of the home front stuff? Yes. Yeah, anti-government feeling, and specifically anti-government feeling among, you could say, kind of like white working class with an emphasis on like white working class immigrants. So it's the sort of Irish and German in New York City specifically, right? It's not like, rural farmers in, Massachusetts or something like that. So that's what I would say about that. Sure. Yes. So yes, in the Confederacy, not in the Union. This is the greenbacks. Those are federally government printed, so those are like pretty consistent. But the Confederate money, the Confederacy is in such a giant mess. Like this is a bill printed by the actual Confederate states, but there are also like if you Google, I think North Carolina printed its own money for a couple of months. So there's individual states with got into printing their own money, even though they like kind of weren't supposed to. This is part of the whole like states' rights versus federal government thing that the Confederacy had so much trouble with. So yeah, some of the states in the Confederacy print their own money with their own like designs and stuff, and that doesn't help things in terms of inflation. Yeah, I think so. If you're thinking about it like in terms of debt. Yeah, so a lot of similar issues. I mean, it's not exactly the same, right? Because there's a little bit more of a developed financial system, I would say, in the Confederacy, and the blockade is a little bit of a difference. But yeah, it's the same basic issue. Like we're fighting a war, we don't have a lot of money, we're sort of fighting a war with among people who aren't so keen on the idea of a strong central government, which was certainly true of the colonies, right, or our young states. And now it's like where does this money come from? Who has the authority to print money? We had those kind of weird the continentals that they printed during the American Revolution. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of good points of comparison there. Other questions? Someone's Michael Scott icon is staring at me. Okay, so I'm going to take us off screen share here and stop recording too. Okay.